Good evening, everyone. We're going to begin in a minute. So please take your seats, as it were. I'm Nancy Sinkoff. I'm the academic director of the Alan and Joan Bildner Center for the Study of Jewish Life, professor of Jewish Studies at Rutgers, Jewish Studies and History at Rutgers. Behind me on my virtual background is a phone card, if any of you ever remember those, that you used to put in a phone booth. And it's from International Women's Day, which was yesterday. But I just thought I couldn't help share it with you because it's such a wonderful artifact of history. And of course, today's course is going to touch on the feminist movement and the recognition of women in the revitalization of Jewish life in America in the post-war years. So I thought it was an appropriate screen for tonight. I think you all know the rules, but it's always good to repeat them. You are all muted. There should be a live transcript now, sorry, on the bottom of the screen for those who want a transcript. And of course, the class is being recorded and you'll have opportunity, if you miss any part of it, to listen to it and watch it later. This is the second part of a three-part mini course that is being taught by the Bildner Center's Reitman visiting scholar, Dr. Greg Drinkwater. I'm not going to reintroduce him. His bio is on our website, and I did a full introduction last week, but all I can tell you, we're delighted that he is engaging with the public in this way, as well as teaching a course on Judaism, love, and sexuality for undergraduates. Greg will teach frontally as he has done last week, and then we will open up to Q&A that I will moderate at the end. So he will teach for about 40 minutes and show a whole bunch of slides to sort of stimulate you in terms of thinking about the visual culture of this period. Tonight's course, his own title within the larger course, is called Centering Jewishness, Jewish Particularism, and the Embrace of Jewish Identity Politics. So thank you again for joining us. And I'm going to turn over the virtual stage to Dr. Greg Drinkwater. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you, Professor Sinkoff, and thank you to the Bildner Center for hosting this and for making this possible. So I'm just going to jump right in and bring up some slides. And as Professor Sinkoff said, I think it's a great opportunity to sort of just get people's mind shifting back 50 plus years by looking at some of these images. In particular, I love sharing images when I teach. So just give me one moment. All right, so sorry. So this is our opening slide, the same images as you saw last time, and then the new title for today's talk about centering Jewishness. So actually, I'm sorry. I have to redo that. I did that incorrectly. I want to be doing a slightly different mode. I apologize. Bear with me for one moment. There we go. Sorry about that. Now you're back to that same image. So what we're going to be talking about today is a shift more towards the political. If last week was focused on the spiritual, and we're going to be, in particular, thinking about the role of Jewish identity politics. There's lots of ways we could deal with Jews in politics in this time period. And so I'm going to cover a lot of ground, but I'm trying to focus in particularly on moments when Jews were asserting a particular Jewish identity politics, as opposed to a more universalist presumption of how Jews might engage politically, or Jews engaging in politics not necessarily as Jews per se. They might have been Jewish. They weren't necessarily calling attention to their Jewish identity. But today we're going to deal with folks who really are calling attention to their Jewish identity very specifically and very intentionally. But to set the stage, I just want to remind us of this time period. I mean, most of you are probably very aware. This is a period, the late 1960s is where we're going to start. The late 1960s is a period of, significant change in American culture, right? There's violence on the streets of US, riots and protests created by racial tension over the war in Vietnam. There's a series of political assassinations, right, of John F. Kennedy earlier in the decade. Then by the late part of the decade, we see Martin Luther King killed, we see Robert Kennedy killed, Malcolm X. And all of this change, all of this seeming chaos demanded a response. But the question was how? What was that going to look like? Who is going to respond? It was a period of uncertainty and chaos, and Jewish leaders and Jewish youth in particular were seeking answers, right? They were at the same time engaged broadly with what we'd already talked about a little bit last time, the emergence of the new left. The new left, which is sort of having a generational struggle with the old left and its universalist certainties based in Marxist theory or labor organizing. That the new left is about youth. It's about alliance. It's about critiques of the military-industrial complex, but also rejecting these sort of totalizing theories that had earlier empowered old left ideologies. Interested in class, but not wanting class to be a totalizing concept, the only thing that people paid attention to. Interested in capitalism, but not wanting, again, to turn to a Marxist, a sort of dogmatic Marxist perspective on what that might mean. It was a period of a relatively assertive rejection of traditional institutions of American life, something not all old left activists had necessarily embraced. It's a focus on the liberational possibilities of uninhibited personal discovery, of sexual experimentation, of use of drugs to alter the mind. Again, another marker of this new left, new generation of activists. And in particular, it was a group of people who were taking on the revolutionary mantle for themselves. These young new left activists, they were seeing themselves as the people who could embrace and engage in struggle, not the workers, right? If the old left saw the need to put the working classes in the vanguard, these new left individuals, many from middle class backgrounds, many university educated, and therefore somewhat privileged in comparison, were putting themselves at the vanguard. The leadership of the new left was largely white, it was largely male, it was largely masculine. Even if they were inspired by the Black freedom movement, their whiteness was still largely the defining element of the new left. So we're going to talk a little bit about how all of this plays out. But first, before we do that, I actually want to shift to last week just to cover for like 2 minutes a couple of things that came up in conversations with participants from our session last time. So one slide that might look familiar if you were here last time was this slide about neo-Hasidism. And I just wanted to clarify something. Someone made a point that I think is worth pointing out, that when I use the term neo-Hasidism as opposed to just describing it as Hasidism, I'm reflecting a sort of scholarly perspective that's engaging a number of different strands. The strand offered by Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, Reb Zalman, but also the strand offered by Martin Buber, Abraham Joshua Heschel, a number of other key figures in the late 20th century, the decades after World War II. But one clarifying point is that for Reb Zalman himself, he never really used the term neo-Hasidism himself. He sort of saw that what he was offering was a revived version of Hasidism, a variant of Hasidism, Hasidism for a new age, a Hasidism that would make sense in this paradigm shift, this new paradigm moment. But I just wanted to clarify that this term neo-Hasidism would not necessarily be a term that Zalman himself might have used. Another slide that I just wanted to jump back to was this one on the birth of the Havurah movement. Something that I talked about was the very maleness of the leadership, particularly of Havurat Shalom. And as you saw, if you watched the brief video from last week about the founding of Havurat Shalom, that it was very clear that the vast majority of the early members were men, and there were these moments where they had to discuss and debate what role women could have. Would it be an egalitarian space or not? But what I didn't mention is that some of the other Havarot, particularly Farbrengen in DC, the Aquarian Minion in Berkeley, were more egalitarian from the get-go. So Havurat Shalom in some ways reflected perhaps a more masculinist vision of the Havorah movement than perhaps some of the other Havorot. Don't want to get into the micro details, but just to say that there was some diversity there overall. And then last, just a minor error, and someone even pointed it out in the chat last time, so you might have seen it, is that my initial slide that looked almost identical to this last week misspelled Reb Marsha's last name with an added E, so apologies for the typo to Reb Marsha and to anyone in her orbit. It was just a simple typographical error. So I will now move on to something else that I didn't bring up last time, and that's something I might have included, which reflects also this question of spiritual counterculture, spiritual developments in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, before we move on to the political, and that is the Baal Tshuva movement. So this, for folks who don't know, is this group of, or sort of this movement describing groups of people who turn to or return to orthodoxy. I mean, the phrase in Hebrew implies a returning. It's not necessarily always folks who grew up Orthodox, lost their observance and then shifted. It's more generally used for people who grew up perhaps in secular Jewish environments and turn as adults generally to an Orthodox way of life. Sometimes modern Orthodox, sometimes Hasidic or other variants of ultra-Orthodox observance. This was a phenomenon that, there were always people who did this for hundreds of years, but the way in which it played out, in particular in the 70s, was yet another manifestation of these people seeking Jewish spirituality, seeking a new home, a new sense of meaning in a world of what felt like mundane, suburban Judaism marked by sort of lack of spiritual focus, lack of Jewish authenticity. So this was yet one other path that some people took, and I didn't bring it up last time, so I thought I would just mention that today is yet one other way of thinking about how people responded to this moment of seeming spiritual crisis. One interesting thing about the Baal Tshuva movement, it still goes on today. There's still people newly turning to Orthodoxy, but the scale of it has died down in many ways in the last 20 to 30 years, roughly. And one other challenge of the Baal Tshuva movement, particularly for folks who turned to Hasidism as their expression of Jewish orthodoxy, was the discovery that the Orthodox world, although very embracing on the surface and eager to take in new people, had a bit of a challenge in that the Orthodox world is based in familial lineage. So that people who are Orthodox, or sorry, Hasidic, are very much defined by their family background, so much so that, marriages, for example, are not just between individuals, but they're between families, to the extent that a sort of problematic member of the family can dampen the marriage prospects of other siblings in that same family, because people are concerned about that. So that's just an example, but folks who are members of Baal Tshuva communities who define themselves as Hasidic often discover that once they get to the second generation, right, that their own children don't really have a full place. This is something that some second generation Baal Tshuva kids in Israel in particular have experienced, that because they don't have these deep-seated Hasidic lineages, their place within the community is somewhat unclear. And some actually leave Hasidic life or orthodoxy altogether for a more modern Orthodox observance, or perhaps secular Judaism altogether. All right, so now jumping into our topic for today, Jewish political involvement in Jewish identity politics. So in terms of Jews involved in political organizing and political activism, particularly in the 1960s, you're all probably familiar with the story of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, and you're probably even familiar with this exact photo of him marching with Martin Luther King during the third Selma Civil Rights March of March 21st, 1965, right? And there's this very famous phrase, which I have up on the screen, of Heschel talking about praying with his legs, right? His legs were praying, sometimes misidentified as him talking about praying with his feet, but either is making the same basic point. The reason why it matters to say praying with his legs versus his feet is actually he's echoing a statement by Frederick Douglass, the former enslaved American and 19th century abolitionist leader who said, quote, "I prayed for 20 years, but received no answer until I prayed with my legs," end quote. So Heschel was echoing that comment. And you may also be aware that in the civil rights movement, generally the 1960s, that a very large number of Jews, particularly young Jewish activists, went to the American South and engaged in on-the-ground activism, sometimes at great risk to their own lives. As you know, there were Jewish individuals injured and killed for their activism. 50% of the young people involved in the Mississippi Summer of 1964 were Jews, for example. 2/3 of the white freedom riders were Jews, for example. And of course, the people like Heschel and other rabbinic figures who joined civil rights marches echoed rabbinic activists of the 1920s and 1930s. They weren't the first American religious leaders to step to the fore. I'm thinking of people like Max Heller, Rabbi Morris Neufeld, William Weinschreiber. But the majority of them were secular Jews, right? So Heschel and a handful of other rabbis are well known as having engaged in the civil rights movement. But the vast majority of these Jews, these freedom riders, the people engaging with the Mississippi Summer, were young, secular, urban Jews from the North. What I want to focus on now is the role that some other religious figures played in this, and not necessarily from the Jewish counterculture. We're going to get to the Jewish counterculture in just a moment. But I first want to address that the Jewish counterculture wasn't the only people doing this, and they didn't emerge out of a vacuum. And Rabbi Heschel wasn't the only person doing this, nor did he emerge out of a vacuum. There was another deeper context going on. So I just specifically mentioned these rabbis in the 1930s who were already working in the South on civil rights for African Americans. They were very much a minority, and they were not that well known, but they had already begun this work decades prior. The Union of American Hebrew Congregations, the Reform Movement's national movement, officially protested lynching in 1935. So there was already an existing legacy. But if today we understand the Reform Movement in particular to have a core vision, a core focus on prophetic Judaism, right? Of Judaism inspired by the biblical prophets of Isaiah, Amos, Micah, that we understand that to sort of be what Reform Judaism in America is, it's important to note that that wasn't always the case. Now, there are these earlier moments that go back to the 30s, that go back to the 20s, etc. But the shift to prophetic Judaism within the Reform movement as sort of one of the key defining elements of what Reform Judaism looks like in the United States, and therefore what Judaism looks like for a very large number of American Jews, is actually something that emerges out of contingent moments in specific individuals. It really only became a defining feature of American Reform Judaism in the post-World War II decades because of the active work of specific folks such as Al Forspan, the founder and head of the Reform Movement's Commission on Social Action for about 40 years. He died about 2 years ago, I believe. Maurice Eisendrath, the head of the UAHC, the head of the Reform Movement's congregational arm from 1943 to 1973, and some others who I'm going to reference in a moment. Already by the 1950s, primarily through the leadership of Al Forspan, over 300 Reform congregations created social action groups and began engaging in social justice and social action organizing of some sort or another, locally, nationally, internationally. The UAHC, again, the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, passed 42 different social justice resolutions in the decade of the 1950s. Not all Jews within the Reform movement, or all Jews generally, though, supported such action. It was controversial in the 50s and the 60s and moving forward. Southern Jewish leaders in particular had to balance the pragmatic realities of living among arch segregationists, white supremacists, and they felt a need to defend Jewish interests against the perception of Jews as potential outside agitators. There were rabbis and Jewish leaders in the American South who supported the civil rights movement vocally. They were a very small number. There were more who supported it quietly. And then there were many others who were quite concerned about the role of the UAHC, the role of rabbis like Heschel, the role of these activist youth coming down for freedom summer rides, because they argued, those folks are coming from the north, and once they are done with their activism, they're going to go home. Whereas Southern Jews have to live among their neighbors every day. And those folks aren't going away. And many of them were quite opposed to integration, opposed to civil rights for African Americans. So it was really a very contentious issue at the time. About 10% of the terrorist bombings in the South in the 1950s were directed against Jewish targets. But Jews were only 1% of the population in the South. So this gives you a sense of the real threat to Jewish lives in the South, and why, from a pragmatic concern, many Jewish leaders were very reticent to be vocally supportive of the civil rights movement. So I want to turn now to the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism. So it emerged out of the Commission on Social Action of Reform Judaism, which I already mentioned, which was something headed by Al Forsman for many, many decades, which was founded in 1953. And he actually created it at the support of Maurice Eisendrath as a way to inspire and encourage more congregational social action committees, something that he had already been doing. He had been driving around the country already for years, encouraging congregations to form their own social action committees. And sort of that 300 of them that emerged in the 50s was largely the result of his personal work. But eventually there was this recognition that local activism by synagogues and social action committees wasn't enough, that the reform movement needed a way to have a voice in Washington, a national lobbying center, a way to really have a seat at the table of national policy and national activism. So the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism was an idea that began in 1959, was officially founded in 1961. And the key builders of it were Al Forsman, Maurice Eisendrath, Rabbi Eugene Lippman, and Rabbi Richard Hirsch, among a number of others. In 1962, they managed to buy a building in central Washington near the Halls of Power, paid for through donations by Kivi and Emily Kaplan. I mentioned them specifically because Kivi Kaplan was then president of the NAACP and also vice chair of the Union of American Hebrew Congregations. So this was someone who was an establishment figure within both the reform world and the world of sort of mainstream civil rights organizing. Interesting to note that in that building that was dedicated in 1962, this 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act were both drafted. They were drafted in the conference room of that very building by the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights. The Leadership Conference on Civil Rights was an organization founded in 1950 that represented the leaders of a number of key organizations fighting for legal equality in the United States. They included the Brothers of Sleeping Car Porters, it included A. Philip Randolph, included the head of the NAACP, included the National Jewish Community Relations Advisory Council head, Arnold Aronson, the head of the United Auto Workers, etc. And they didn't have an official office or space in which to meet, so they met regularly at this Religious Action Center building in Washington, D.C., which is why those bills were actually drafted in that building directly. And also worth noting is that through the efforts of the Religious Action Center, the reform movement became in 1968 the first of the national Jewish organizations in the country to oppose the war in Vietnam. And Religious Action Center staff engaged in strategy sessions to help increase Jewish involvement in anti-war efforts across the country. So just to kind of give you a taste of what that sounds like, or what that looks like rather. And what you have here in terms of images are Reform Jews protesting proudly on the left. In the middle, you have Maurice Eisendrath carrying a Torah with Abraham Joshua Heschel to his side and Martin Luther King on the other. And on the right, there, the signing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 by President Johnson. So now to turn to something very specific. So if you've all probably heard of Heschel and his role in marching in Selma with Martin Luther King, you may not have heard about what happened in St. Augustine, Florida in June 1964. So the backdrop. After the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education ruling by the Supreme Court that should have ended segregated schools, the public schools of St. Augustine, Florida remain nearly 100% white. The handful of Black children attending public schools there saw their homes burned and their parents fired from their jobs. So Black organizers in Florida decided to try and do something about this. In particular, Dr. Robert Haling, one of the first Black dentists in Florida, founded an NAACP youth council there and became active in nonviolent direct action protest in the city of St. Augustine. National NAACP leaders tried to push the hand of St. Augustine leaders by ending federal funding for the schools in St. Augustine until and if they were desegregated. In response, the KKK lashed out with a series of violent attacks and intimidation against local Black residents. Dr. Haling encouraged local Black residents and activists to arm themselves in response. Ultimately, in response to this, he and 4 others were kidnapped and attacked by the KKK. They escaped alive, but after being injured. So in June of 1964, June 16th, the Central Conference of American Rabbis, which is the rabbinic arm, the national rabbinic arm of the Reform movement, were holding their annual conference in New Jersey when Rabbi Israel Dresner, Rabbi Cy Dresner, read a telegram to the gathered group from Martin Luther King, asking them specifically to send rabbis down to St. Augustine, Florida, to bear prophetic witness against social evils of our time, to contribute to the growing mobilization against the discriminatory policies in St. Augustine, not just about the schools, but there was a broader movement to address civil rights in St. Augustine. And he requested that a delegation of CCAR rabbis come south as quickly as possible. So Rabbi Dresner, who was an ally of Dr. King and had worked with him for a number of years, was well aware of the risks involved in joining in any activism in St. Augustine. He had actually himself been arrested several times after protests in the South for his work on behalf of civil rights. But nevertheless, within a few hours, he managed to gather 16 rabbis, as well as Al Forsman, who was actually not a rabbi, to head to Florida the very next morning. They set out the next day with almost no baggage. They didn't think they were going to stay long. And once they joined the protests there, that were specifically in that moment, they were trying to desegregate hotels and motels in Florida. And so the particular protest they joined was an effort to desegregate a motor lodge there that had a pool and had a small cafe. And they sat down at the cafe with Black activists, white and Black together. White and Black activists jumped into the pool, which was segregated. Black individuals were not allowed. And after they arrived there and engaged in the protest, the 17 figures from the Reform movement were all arrested in what, at the time, was the largest mass arrest of rabbis in American history. And the images on the top are both showing the arrest of these rabbis and their harassment by the manager of the hotel. On the right, it's actually the hotel manager who's grabbing him and trying to pull him away from a table. And on the left, it's a very bizarre image. The hotel manager, after seeing the group of Black and white individuals that jumped into the hotel pool, poured acid into the pool in an effort to get them out. And then a fully dressed police officer who took off his shoes only, jumped into the pool to try to pull them out and arrest them. And of course, these images made the national press. So as they sat in jail that night, Forsman and the rabbis wrote "Why We Went," a letter from St. Augustine jail. And on the bottom right, it's a very small font, so I apologize for those who aren't able to see it, is the list of all the individuals who were there. But I think it's worth reading this because this is going to be a bit of a bridge in our talk here from this question of universal activism on behalf of the working classes or on behalf of all oppressed people to particularism, this idea of focusing on either your own community, your own self, or some particular specific interest. So in there, it's a much longer letter, but this is a brief excerpt. We came because we could not stand quietly by our brother's blood. Biblical allusion, right, of course. We had done that too many times before, referencing, some guilt, a bit of a mea culpa of not having stood up enough already in the course of the 1950s and the early 1960s, on behalf of Black civil rights. We came as Jews who remember the millions of faceless people who stood quietly, watching the smoke rise from Hitler's crematoria. So last time we mentioned the effect of the Holocaust and having to rethink what American Judaism looks like in the wake of the Holocaust. What does social activism look like? What does politics look like? What responsibility do we as Jews have? And particularly a couple of years after the publication of Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem, which sort of accused Jews of not having done enough themselves to save their own brethren, but also this sort of growing sense that American Jews and American political leaders in general have not done quite enough. But here's the core thing that I really wanted to read. We believe in man's ability to fulfill God's commands with God's help. We make no messianic estimate of man's power, and certainly not of what we did here, but it has reaffirmed our faith in the significance of the deed. So we must confess in all humility that we did this as much in fulfillment of our faith and response to inner need as in service to our Negro brothers. We came to stand with our brothers and in the process have learned more about ourselves and our God. In obeying him, we become ourselves. In following his will, we fulfill ourselves. He has guided, sustained, and strengthened us in a way that we could not manage on our own. Of course, bringing up the Sheikhianu blessing there. So there you have it, is this moment of transition, right? This sort of moment of in-betweenness of, is this about Jewish universalism? Or was this in some ways a Jewish particularist practice? Should we understand the efforts of Abraham Joshua Heschel, of these rabbis in St. Augustine, and of other Jews engaging in civil rights activism, as in some ways a Jewish particularist response, right? It's something we could discuss. But I think it's a nice bridge between the activism of Heschel and where we're going to turn next, which is the Freedom Seder. So hopefully you were able to listen to and watch this brief excerpt from the actual Freedom Seder. It's amazing footage. But I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, and I'm largely relying here on some insights about the Freedom Seder from the Jewish studies scholar Rev. Ellen Prell, a cultural anthropologist. And we're going to talk in a moment about how the Freedom Seder was both vilified and celebrated among Jews generally. So we'll turn to that in a moment. But it marks a key moment in this moment of transition between the old left of universalism and the new left of identity politics and particularism, right? So the new left, and Arthur Wasco was a part of this, is emerging out of a number of other things that we don't really have time to go into. But what's important to note is that Arthur Wasco was minimally Jewishly active in this era. I mean, if we now see him as a rabbi and as one of the key founders of Jewish renewal, and sort of imagine him as a key Jewish figure because of his writing of this new Haggadah and creation of the Jewish Seder, at the time he was really more of a sort of general Jewish New Left activist who wasn't necessarily lifting up his Jewishness per se. But he talks about in sort of reflecting back on this moment of why the Freedom Seder, why did he write this new Haggadah? He'd already been active in supporting Black communities in DC and elsewhere, particularly in the periods of riots after Martin Luther King's assassination in 1968. And he remembered walking home after the riots in 1968 to his neighborhood in Adams Morgan and seeing military vehicles on the streets of Washington, DC, as he was on his way to a Passover Seder 8 days after Martin Luther King's assassination. And seeing these military street vehicles on the streets as he was walking to a Seder sparked in him an awakening of Jewish consciousness. He actually specifically referenced those military vehicles as Amalek, as this sort of war enemy of the Jews, as Pharaoh's army, the specific enemy within the Haggadah. So this got him thinking, and by time of Passover coming around the following year, he had already written this new Haggadah that bridged this question of Jewish liberation and African-American liberation that bridged the old and the new and that brought in modern day injustices. So 800 people attended the event in the basement of Lincoln Temple, a Black church. And it was a Seder held on the anniversary of Martin Luther King's death in the third night of Passover of that particular year. And laid out, as you probably saw in the video if you watched it, were long tables with candles and matzah. And the Seder was co-led not just by Arthur Waskow, but also by Topper Carew, who was then an urban designer and an activist, and they knew each other from other activist circles. And Topper Carew actually remembers telling folks after that prior to that, he'd never even heard of a Seder. He didn't know what it was. But he recognized that religion had long played a role in the civil rights movement, and that perhaps doing some sort of Jewishly religious event might be worth doing. So the Freedom Seder had a goal, in part, of improving the strained relationship between Blacks and Jews of this era, which is a very big topic that I don't have a lot of time to go into why it had become strained after sort of these other moments earlier in the 1950s and 60s. His Haggadah included, in addition to reference to the African-American civil rights movement, discussions of nuclear disarmament, policy, police brutality, the war in Vietnam. It mentioned Martin Luther King and Gandhi as prophets alongside Elijah. It brought up Eldridge Cleaver as a shofet, as a judge. And the Seder ended, as you probably saw in the video, with chants of liberation now and a singing of the song Go Down Moses, this Black spiritual. After the Seder, Waskow's Haggadah began circulating widely and then began being distributed by Jews for Urban Justice all across the country. And the Freedom Seder, in many ways, is sort of the word text that sparks the proliferation of particular Haggadot that emerged in the decades that followed. And many of you might be familiar with how many different types of Haggadot now exist and how personal and particular people make them. You know, they're made for particular groups, they're made for particular families, they're made for particular causes, from, you know, environmentalism to feminism to LGBT politics to social justice for workers, whatever it might be. Now, it's important to note that Arthur Waskow was not the first person to do this, to bring contemporary politics into the Seder. It, in fact, had already happened within Yiddish circles in America in the 1930s and 40s. It had happened in the kibbutz movement in Israel in the 1940s and 50s. But Arthur Waskow's Freedom Seder really, though, still remains the model against which many of these other types of new Haggadot are modeled. The Freedom Seder reflected a bringing together of traditional Jewish practices and traditions in issues of concern to American youth. And it reflected the struggle over identity politics within the left, the role of particularism. And it was, interestingly, again, on this cusp, it wasn't quite a universalist event, nor was it fully a particularist event. It was Jewish, but held in a church. It was a traditional Jewish ritual, but redefined in support of a non-Jewish struggle for justice. But it demonstrated that Jewish ritual and tradition had something to offer in the struggle against oppression. It, of course, sparked controversy. As I mentioned, here's an interesting quote from Norman Podhoretz, lambasting it as the product of the wicked son, using this term from the Haggadah itself, that Waskow, as the wicked son, seems to have written in collaboration with his brother, the simpleton, under the title of the Freedom Seder, and that his wickedness consists of having removed himself from the community. Should his teeth then not be set on edge, and should he not be told that he has betrayed one of the most essential principles of the religion of his fathers? To which Rabbi Art Green, a friend of Waskow and one of the founders of Havarat Shalom, responds, I too question the political appropriation of traditional symbols. Norman Podhoretz's use of the wicked son image to characterize Arthur Waskow strikes me as a prime example of such usage. So there was, debate about this use of referencing Thoreau and Gandhi as rabbis, referencing Eldridge Cleaver as a shofet, Allen Ginsberg as a tzaddik, among other protests. Ironically, if you watch the video of this, and I, is perhaps younger than some other folks on this group, maybe folks who are in their 70s and 80s might have different memories. I saw this actually as a largely very Jewish event. Because so many Seders outside the Orthodox world today look often not unlike the Freedom Seder, at least most of the Seders I've been to in my life. It's hard for me to sort of recognize this critique of it for not being Jewish enough. Go Down Moses has been sung at every Seder I've ever been to. These evocations of the liberation of other peoples has been brought up at every Seder I've ever been to. So in many ways, it's so transformed Seders that we sort of don't recognize how different they might be today. So this shift to particularism, of course, is happening within a context. It's not just Jews who are doing this, right? The Black Power movement is doing this, right? Shifting to a focus on their own liberation. The gay liberation movement, women's liberation, and particularly women's separatism, the Chicana movement, etc. Right? So there's a broader context, and Jews are but one example. One key example of this, of course, is the American Soviet Jewry movement. It offers us a key example of how Jewish activists from the 1960s forward increasingly deployed Jewish particularism, and specifically Jewish rituals and Jewish religious symbolism, as tactics of protest. Activists in the Soviet Jewry movement, as with Jewish activists engaged with other causes, helped construct a public political culture that defined Jewish participation in American identity politics as not just something to be done Jewishly, but specifically as a Jewish religious imperative. And that's the key thing that I want to focus on for the rest of this discussion, is not just that Jews are doing activism on behalf of Jews, but they're doing it in a way that is remaking the spiritual understanding of Judaism, Jewish religious practice, that they're bringing a Jewish religious imperative to their activism. And so there's lots of other ways we could talk about Jewish identity politics and Jewish political activism in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, but we're just going to center on those aspects of it that are sort of changing the way Judaism as a religion is understood in America. And I think the Freedom Seder had already started to do that. So public and vocal support for Soviet Jews became one of the key pillars of a specifically American Jewish version of civil religion in the late 60s, the 70s, and the 1980s. In this, the Soviet Jewry movement sat alongside the other core pillars of support for Israel, memorializing the Holocaust, and fighting anti-Semitism, to refer back to some things we talked about last time. What linked these four pillars was a focus on the unity of Jewish peoplehood, a mutual responsibility of Jews for each other, and the imperative of Jewish survival. Remember Emil Fackenheim's 614th commandment to not give Hitler a posthumous victory. So Jewish studies scholar Shaul Kellner, not Shul Magid, who I referenced last time, Shul Kellner, has argued that the American Soviet Jewry movement's use of Jewish rituals and symbolism in their public protests helped construct the movement as one of these four pillars of American Jewish civil religion. Some examples of these new rituals and symbols include the use of shofars during public protest marches. You can see that in the image on the right. They're holding shofars and making shofar blasts there. And they're also wearing talitot, Jewish prayer shawls. Also think of the use of such biblically based slogans as "I am my brother's keeper," often written in Hebrew, or the tradition of the matzah of hope, in which Jews were encouraged to hold up a separate fourth matzah during Passover Seders as symbols of hope for the eventual freedom of Soviet Jews, with an associated reading and blessing, and in some cases, setting aside an empty chair at the table to symbolize Soviet Jews who were imprisoned for seeking exit visas or for advocating for religious freedom. This also evoked the Soviet bans on the production of matzah and the bravery of those Jews who made and distributed matzah in an underground movement, particularly in the early 1960s. Such practices embedded the experience of Soviet Jews within the frame of the Passover story of liberation, while proposing the liberation of Passover as the very model that would resolve the problem of Soviet Jews. There's also the example on the left of bar and bat mitzvah twins, who were another such symbol. And in this case, we actually have someone with literal twins. He got a pair of twins as his bar mitzvah twins. This was where young American Jews would invoke a specific Soviet Jewish youth unable to have a bar bat mitzvah. This particular image is from 1983 from a Pennsylvania synagogue. And then thousands of such twinning rituals took place through the efforts of Action for Soviet Jewry and other national Soviet Jewry organizations. By not simply relying on universalizing slogans or symbols of abstract human rights, but instead creating political theater centered on embodied, meaning-generated protest tactics with specifically Jewish symbolism, these activists contributed to building a new form of a Jewish identity politics that, to use Shaul Kellner's phrasing, was, quote, infused with transcendental significance. What Kellner means by this is that these activists merged both expressive and instrumental political action, and they also merged secular politics and religious cosmology. They created ritualized protest that shifted out of the realm of the mundane secular political act and instead became sacred Jewish obligations, new Jewish mitzvot. And the Free Soviet Jewry movement built on the idea of the Freedom Seder and used that terminology and appropriated it for their own purposes. Through activities like Passover marches, which brought previously private, home-based Jewish rituals to the streets, and the Matzah of Hope rituals, which brought political protests into the home, Jews enacted and thereby advocated the idea that, quote, an authentic religious Judaism was one that was engaged in redemptive political action in support of other Jews. They also enacted and thereby advocated the idea that an authentic American Jewish politics was one that unapologetically invoked Judaic ritual forms, right? So this is getting back to this idea of ritual, of liturgy, of Jewish religious and spiritual practice as being part and parcel of this political activism. These rituals then became political acts tied to deeply emotionally salient and embodied practices, such as the Seder, such as the blowing of the shofar, the wearing of tzitzit. In Kellner's words, they constructed the Soviet Jewry movement as a form of redemptive politics. It was also good PR and good organizing, right? The B'nai Mitzvah Twinning Program, for example, raised awareness about the plight of Soviet Jewry among synagogue members and the extended families of Jewish youth. It also broadened participation in the movement and empowered Jewish youth as activists and spokespeople for the Soviet Jewry movement. The Matzah of Hope initiative and other Passover-related actions reached people through the Jewish holiday most celebrated among American Jews. And this use of public Jewish ritual as political theater also connects us back to the things we discussed last time of coming to terms with the Holocaust, of declining American anti-Semitism, and particularly for thinking about the student struggle for Soviet Jewry, the organization founded in 1964 by Jacob Birnbaum, a German-born but British Jew who immigrated to the US. This is a group made up largely of younger Jews who saw themselves as the more adept and forceful alternative to some of the more mainstream and centrist Jewish groups focused on advocacy for Soviet Jews. They tried to distinguish themselves from their parents' generation, implicitly and sometimes explicitly framing their activism as the opposite of the silence with which they felt the previous generation had reacted to the unfolding of the Holocaust. And they used this phrase, struggle, intentionally as an ironic and sort of joking nod to the use of class struggle in Marxist thought. Again, another sort of shift between old left and new left. And they, were also very politically pragmatic. They worked with Rabbi Yitz Greenberg to establish the Center for Soviet Jewry to reach non-youth, to reach their parents' generation as well. So they're kind of doing both at the same time. Now I want to turn to another major Soviet Jewry activist, Meir Kahane, to point out that the kind of activism that was imbued with spiritual and religious significance is not just an aspect of the Jewish left, because Meir Kahane, of course, is a very right-wing figure. And Shaul Magid, so not Shaul Kellner, the other Shaul, has actually even argued that Kahane can be understood as having promoted a vision of a right-wing post-colonial Jewish revolutionary theory, an offering an ethics of violence, with a belief that violence was somehow necessary to ensure Jewish survival, in the same way that perhaps Frantz Fanon in North Africa did, as the Black Panthers did from the left. But Kahane found a way to invoke radical political violence as an Jewish ethical imperative from the far right. He was a devotee of Vladimir Jabotinsky and of right-wing revisionist Zionism, ordained as an Orthodox rabbi, a consummate self-promoter, someone who had a very problematic personal life, which I won't get into, and he founded the Jewish Defense League in 1968, and particularly as an organization whose purpose was to protect Jews by any means necessary, to fight anti-Semitism by any means necessary, using the same phrasing and same rhetoric as the Black Panthers, who he simultaneously feared as one of the core threats to Jews in some of these Black Jewish conflicts, particularly in New York at the time, while also admiring their chutzpah, right? I mean, he saw in them a model that he could emulate. And he took on the struggle for Soviet Jewry both as sort of a moral imperative, but also as a way to engage in political theater that gave him an enormous platform and enormous publicity and public relations visibility. I mean, as I said, he was a consummate self-promoter. He wanted to be in the press. And so he was focusing on advocating violence as a way to manage anti-Semitism, as a form of politics to assert difference from the Jewish community establishment, to sort of say, a nudge the Jewish community establishment to say, I'm going to do this differently, but also as a form of subject formation, right? Violence as a path to reconstructing the Jewish subject. He was engaging in a sort of vision of reimagining Jews as an assertive, masculinist, muscular figure in the same way that other figures in the Zionist movement since the early 20th century have been working on creating this vision of muscular Judaism, right? So Meir Kahane doesn't really have a full understanding of this, but he's engaging in the same kind of rhetoric, that if Jews have long been seen as weak, as emasculated, as unable to respond, JDL is going to change that. So the goal was protecting Jews from anti-Semitism, and use this Holocaust consciousness of the slogan, never again, and a radical form of Jewish nationalism. And he critiqued the American Jewish establishment by saying essentially that Jews in America faced an existential threat that the mainstream Jewish community was simply ignoring. He saw waves of anti-Semitism exploding across the country, and that violence was therefore justified in response. And he said, if I succeeded in instilling fear in you, I consider this evening a success. He would say that at many of his events. And Irv Rubin, the national chair of the JDL, spoke of one of their training camps in the Catskills that, quote, we teach young people to have a sane fist attached to a sane head, not to advocate this nebbish posture people seem to think is so popular. Now to sort of shift from that sort of masculinist violent bombast to a completely different direction, which is Jewish feminism. Now, of course, we could teach an entire class on Jewish feminism just of the 1970s. So I'm going to be extremely brief, and I'm also recognizing that I'm now past time, so I'm going to make this extraordinarily brief, and I apologize for giving short shrift to Jewish feminism by sort of having it be at the end and not giving it enough concentration. But what I want to think about are Jewish feminists, not as those, again, who happened to be Jewish, who were engaged in universalizing Jewish activism, or at least on behalf, particularist in that it's on behalf of women, but universalizing in the sense that it's global in scope, women writ large, but those women who were trying specifically to remake the way Judaism engaged with women. So we have on the left an image from Ezrat Nashim, founded in 1971 as a women's study group within the Jewish counterculture in New York that was trying to collect information on the status of women in Judaism and kind of trying to develop ways to rectify inequalities within Orthodox and conservative communities, more observant communities in general. People like Martha Ecclesburg, Paula Hyman, Elizabeth Colton, Dina Rosenfeld, and others were original members. And on the right, you have the editorial board of Bridges, a Jewish feminist publication whose issues reflected the multiplicity of Jewish experiences and identities, and that were really a key voice of Jewish intersectional activism around class, ethnicity. They raised up Sephardic and Mizrahi voices, trying to push back against Ashkenazi normative Judaism, etc. And of course, the 1970s through the 1980s sees the biggest shift in mainstream religious Judaism, which is the ordination of women as rabbis, with the first being Sally Prezant in 1972, followed by Sally Eisenberg Sasso, went by Sally Sasso at the time in 1974 in the Reconstructionist movement, Lynn Gottlieb in Jewish Renewal, and then Amy Eilberg in 1985, which is the image on the bottom. You see her with her all-male ordination class of the conservative movement in 1985. And then eventually, in the 2000s, Orthodox women, the first being Sarah Hurwitz, ordained, and still this is hotly debated within the Orthodox world, whether they're really fully recognized as rabbis by everyone within the Orthodox world. There are segments of Orthodoxy that recognize them and segments that do not. Given time, I'm going to skip 2 other slides that I'll use next week because they're actually about lesbian and queer Jewish activists. And I'm going to go directly to the Jewish Liberation Project, which is this other text I had sent around. And then we'll come back to these other 2 slides that I was going to talk about around Jewish lesbians next time. So the Jewish Liberation Project was this very short-lived effort, but the reason why I wanted to bring it up, even though it was very short-lived, is it really articulated in that document that I sent around a very succinct and very clear reflection of this new countercultural vision of what Jewish communal life ought to look like, right? What does a critique of Jewish life, of Jewish spiritual life, of Jewish organizational life, of Jewish personal life look like? And there were different organizations doing this in different ways, in different sort of bites of the pie. But the Jewish Liberation Project, this manifesto that I shared with you, really sort of covers it all in just a few pages. They're applying new left ideologies, tactics, and vocabulary to particularist Jewish interests. They were promoting Jewish nationalism, specifically radical Zionism, and Jewish religious and cultural revival, all as linked together. They were absolutely shifting from universalism to particularism, and they were trying to bring particularism into the universalist program of the New Left. They were trying to become the Jewish wing of the New Left. Within the left, Zionism at that time was beginning to be demonized, particularly by Black nationalists. So they were pushing back on that specifically, but they were also trying to push back against anti-Semitism and sort of ignorance of Jewish ritual life and spiritual life generally in the New Left. They were seeing Israel as an authentic liberation struggle of their own, in the same way that others on the New Left were embracing the liberation struggles of anti-colonial activists in the Third World, or of Black Americans through the Black Panthers. One of the other core founders, besides Aviva Cantor, who you see on the left, was Itzhak Epstein, who actually attended the Freedom Seder in 1969 of Arthur Waskow. So all these things are linked, of course, they're all learning from each other. He was a co-founder and is now actually active with the Democratic Socialists of America in New York, and had also been active in Students for a Democratic Society, the very mainstream non-Jewish arm of the New Left, and had known Aviva Cantor because both had been active in the Zionist youth group B'nai Akiva. And they actually managed to get support for the Jewish Liberation Project through the a group that sort of is a spin-off for young adults who had emerged out of B'nai Akiva and these socialist Zionist groups. So the GLP was explicitly not Zionist, but also focused on other Jewish themes within the Jewish community, unlike, for example, Arthur Waskow and Jews for Urban Justice, the promoters of the Freedom Seder, who really focused beyond the Seder, mostly on universal secular causes. The Jewish Liberation Project was really trying to work on broader themes. And they began creating a journal called the Jewish Liberation Journal, which Aviva Cantor was the editor, that went on for several years. And in that, Epstein actually critiqued Waskow's Freedom Seder for being insufficiently Jewish. Again, I kind of read it differently, but he felt that the Haggadah there of Arthur Waskow gave the overall impression that the most significant contemporary Jewish experience is the Black Revolution. And he was trying to really urge, as was Aviva Cantor, that Jews needed to focus on what needed to change within the Jewish world, what needed to change to get Jews committed to Israel and Zionism, what needed to change to get the Jewish establishment focused on Jewish education, on democratic principles. And to make that happen, they actually staged a protest in April 1970, when, as part of a broader coalition, they raided the office of the New York Jewish Federation building during a major meeting, demanding that, quote, the charity cabal of the Jewish Federation reorient its priorities and commit itself to meeting the needs of New York's Jews. And they were arrested. About 35 people were arrested from that. In the end, they didn't necessarily change Federation policy, but they did bring awareness to the demands of this Jewish left that was not just wanting to protest their parents' generation in terms of their core political universal commitments, but they were actually really wanting to embrace and revive Judaism. So I recognize and apologize, I'm very over. I will now stop now and turn to discussion and questions.
So thank you so much. There's so much here. It's just fabulous. I want to see if I can spotlight me. Yeah, here we are. So I want to make sure that our audience feels free to ask some questions. It is a little bit late, but we can stay on for 10 more minutes. I have a number of questions or observations, but I would like to hear from you. And so please don't hesitate to throw a question into the chat. And sometimes I've noticed that you kind of have to get the ball rolling. So maybe I will just pose my questions / observations that might help. So first of all, Greg, I thought it was, again, a whiplashed but incredible survey of the dynamism of these years. And I think, it's actually incredible if you step back and think, wow, look at all the ways in which these American Jews were activists. And you also showed that it's not homogeneous. It's the very heterogeneous set of identities that range from Jews acting, quote unquote, only for universalist causes, Jews with similar tactics acting, if you will, only for so-called Jewish particularist causes, but they're all, it reminds me a little bit of the Second Temple. I know it's kind of crazy, but which I always convey as like a stew. Like the Second Temple is this enormous stew of religious identities and textualities, and people pick and choose, and what we get from that is Essenes and Qumran and Christians and Jesus-loving Jews and what becomes rabbinic Jews, right? In this like cauldron of ideas. And obviously, someone's probably going to be scandalized that I'm comparing post-war America to the Second Temple period, but okay, I'm old enough now, I can scandalize anyone. That's my attitude. But I think it's fascinating.
I think this. I agree with you. I think this sort of, and what marks the Second Temple period as well, is a sense that not only were they all offering these different visions, but they all felt they had the right one, right? They all had these sort of apocalyptic visions of themselves as the right answer to how to do Jewish moving forward.
Right, exactly this. So I actually didn't intend to link it, my question or observation, to really the longue durée to the Jewish past, but I want to say something about the sort of the quintessential Americanness of this because I think it's something that's so much a part of American culture, which is this tension between sort of collective identity and individual identity, or individual fulfillment and collective. So I would like you to, if you would, sort of think or unpack that a little bit more for us about these movements, the way they function on both of those registers, if you will. So that was one thing. And the other aspect, and you alluded to it a little bit in the Soviet Jewry movement, and it's something that an activist, Michael Berenbaum, who actually was very important in the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, told me when I interviewed him about this criticism of the so-called myth of silence, that American Jews and the American Jewish leadership did nothing for the Jews of Europe during the war and in the immediate post-war years. And Berenbaum was initially a critic, agreeing with this idea that American Jews were silent. And now, partly because of all the historiography that has come out, he conceded to me, and not in a Shamti way, but he said, yes, it was a myth, but it was a useful myth because it helped us galvanize for fighting the cause of Soviet Jewry. So my question to you, or rather an observation that I look forward to hearing from you about, is clearly this generation of American Jews, 60s, 70s, 80s, they feel so at home in America that they can perform the theater of Jewishness in a very public way, in ways their parents very, maybe the Stephen Wises or the Abba Hillel Silvers or, Peter Bergson, we can point to some individuals. But this, as you said, this performance on the American stage tells me that they felt very at home in America, very enfranchised. And even though they are pleading for a certain kind of group recognition. So I guess in some ways they related questions or observations. And if you want to talk about them, then I'll be able to look at the chat and see. I think I got the ball rolling. Which is
it's, the irony, exactly, I think what you hint at is that, if what's seeming to drive their activism is both a sense of a moribund American Judaism, but also a sense that Jews are not fully recognized enough within American society. The irony is it's only because Jews are recognized enough and are comfortable enough in American society that they're able to feel the confidence to do what they're doing, right? So they're both happening at the same time. Youth often have slanted views of the
everything
of what's actually going on in front of them. So not to dismiss the anti-Semitism of the era, not to dismiss Jewish silence. It was still very much an issue in the 1960s and 1970s. It's very real, but absolutely, these were Jews who had comfort, who had, in general, it's a mixed bag, but in general, on average, had privilege, had comfort, had affluence, had capacity to be visible, to shift away from universal causes which had served Jews so well. Focusing on universal causes had been one of the reasons Jews were able to achieve the middle-class success and privilege that they had by creating a level playing field in theory, right, which we now know was never really a level playing field at all, but at least the rhetoric of one, as a path to middle-class upward mobility. And that had served Jews very well, but they now had the capacity to critique that and to look inward on their own issues. This issue of the myth of silence around the Holocaust is also, absolutely. I think without that myth of silence, some of the sort of urgency, some of the drive might have been lacking. And again, whether that myth is in fact an accurate reflection is still, I think, debated among historians. It's been debunked by some, although some don't entirely find that debunking convincing. There were Jewish responses to the Holocaust happening immediately in the 40s is absolutely the case, but how widely disseminated, how public was awareness of that.
Right. But I think the question is the stage of those reactions, right? Were they? But anyway, just so everyone knows, the myth of silence, because I sometimes think it's a little in-group speak. The myth of silence is the accusation that the American Jewish leadership, the mainstream American Jewish leadership, and the American Jewish community writ large, was so intent on suburbanizing and, having the toaster oven, whatever, the toaster, that they were apathetic towards the fate of their European brethren. And this was a very, very strong, and that it took until the 6-Day War for Jews to wake up to the genocidal possibilities of global politics. And that was debated for a long time. As Greg said, some people, it's been debunked, but I guess there's still some people who are holding on to it. So you should just know that that's kind of out there in terms of thinking about Jewish politics in the post-war years. So we have a couple of questions. One is, several people are curious about what happened to these groups. What is the legacy of this kind of activism? What survives today? The person says we don't see them. Is it all because of the, I'm adding language here, because of the heightened issues about Israel as a colonial country or not, and the Palestinian problem? So what's the legacy in your view of this incredibly dynamic period of American?
It's sort of a mix. Unfortunately, it's kind of depends on which one you're talking about. Right? So for example, the legacy of Meir Kahane and the JDL lives on in Israeli politics very clearly and very strongly. It doesn't live on very much in America. massacre in Hebron. I'm blanking on what year that was.
Baruch Goldstein. It was the spring of 1994. I'll never forget it.
Not so terribly long ago, was in fact in part inspired by this kind of thinking, as was the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, and unto today, right? So that sort of has a place that sort of shifts over to Israel. In terms of Jewish feminism, we mentioned very briefly, I think last time, about this sort of phrase of the sort of feminization of American religious Judaism, right? That the majority of rabbinical students in the Reform and Reconstructionist seminaries today are women, and close to a majority in the conservative movement. Many of the core leaders of synagogue groups today are women. And so there's this way in which Jewish feminists succeeded in claiming ownership over Judaism. And of course, many of these feminist groups are still around. And unfortunately, I didn't get to talk enough about the two groups that I was going to talk a little bit about more. So we'll shift that till next time. I was going to talk about the Vilachayas and B'nai Esh, and I won't explain what those are right now because it'd be too complicated. They are still around in different reasons. But the Jewish Liberation Project ultimately dies out very quickly, but this sort of vision of radical Zionism as a sort of alternative way of thinking about Zionism within American Judaism very quickly loses credence in the 1980s, particularly after the massacres in southern Lebanon in 1982, and sort of mass condemnation among progressive and leftist activists of Israeli policies there and in the West Bank and Gaza, so that there's just sort of this bifurcation within Zionist activism that really shuts down the capacity to have a left critique of Zionism that is still avowedly Zionist, as opposed to anti-Zionist or other.
So what you're showing, and I think it's very important. Sometimes we all want answers, and sometimes we don't have answers. We just have diagnoses or fissures. And what you've shown is that you've marked these movements, the issues of balancing universalism and particularism, the collective and the individual, the universal, global, and the Jewish, that this is what's on everyone's minds. And as history evolves in the way that it does, certain roads can be taken and certain roads can't be taken. And the idea of sort of being a radical left Zionist in the American political left in this moment in the late 80s, the Lebanon War, etc., and the continued tenacious hold on, and I'm always careful to say, the occupied territories, Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, choose your rhetoric, but that this indicates the problem, but there isn't really an answer to it. But that's sort of why you don't see those groups. There's also, you didn't mention, and maybe you will next week, there were challenges to the American Jewish political establishment in those years, and they were not let into the room, so to speak, brera, right? And we have some parallels in today's world with questions about Hillel and also J Street and things like that. I'll just leave that. I'm sure other people want to talk about that.
One last quick thing I'll say, and I know we need to wrap up, is
there's one more question I want to take from the floor, but go ahead.
Is in terms of Soviet Jewry, right? Is that ultimately, in some ways, that movement succeeded, right? It depends on what how you understand the end of the Cold War and the mass migration of former Soviet Jews out of the Soviet Union and into Israel, the United States, and elsewhere. But ironically, here's the sort of rub, is that if in the 1960s and 1970s, the Free Soviet Jewry movement saw itself as speaking on behalf of this silenced people, right? Another question of a myth of silence is that the Jews in the Soviet Union were somehow seen as sort of this silent mass that someone needed to speak on their behalf, sort of in a very paternalistic kind of way, and often from the left, although not exclusively, Meir Kahane being one example. Elie Wiesel also put himself forward as a very prominent activist on behalf of Soviet Jews, many other mainstream figures. The irony is that now former Soviet Jews are in many ways remaking global Judaism today, and often from the right.
Yeah.
Right? Former Soviet Jews are much more likely to be right-wing voters in Israel and the United States, as well as actually elsewhere in the world, and have much more socially and politically conservative perspective on what Jewish life should look like, on what global politics should look like. And they are increasingly dominating whether it's through funding or actual leadership positions, a number of major institutions of global Jewry. So it's sort of an interesting turnaround of American Jews feeling like they have to benevolently, advocate on behalf of this group of people in the Soviet Union who are now, in some ways, sort of running the show in some contexts.
Well, men make history, but not as they intend. Right. So the last question has to do with, and references a work by the scholar Mark Dollinger, who has a new book, Black Power and Jewish Politics, and wrote an earlier book on, take it off the shelf, there you go. Well informed, and had an earlier book on Jewish social inclusion and integration during the mid-20th century. And Dollinger, in some ways, is trying to resurrect moments of alliance among Blacks and Jews in mid-century in 60s, 70s, 80s. And the question is that there were stronger ties than people know about mainstream Jewish organizations and Black nationalist leaders. And the questioner would like to hear a little bit more about that. And I'm not entirely clear, how would this message been heard by these more radical groups? I guess the question really, what's being asked is, how did Black nationalists devoted to the enfranchisement and the mobility and the fighting anti-Black racism in America, how did they interact with these Jewish organizations? And I think that will have to be our last question. So I want to tell everyone, if you have questions for Dr. Drinkwater, I think you can send them to him. If he has time to answer them, he will. And also, please look on the Bildner Center calendar for our 2 remaining programs, but let him finish at least with that question. Yeah,
I'm very happy to engage via email, or the topic next week is a different topic. As we did some mop up of last week, this week we can do that again. And just quickly, another show and tell book, if you want to learn more about the Soviet Jewry movement, written by a journalist. So very nicely, very sort of easy read, not academic jargon, I promise you. In any case, in terms of Mark Dollinger's argument, what he's discovering is that if I didn't go into it, but I referenced this sort of moment of rupture between Jews and Black activists in the late 1960s. And generally, the sort of received narrative is that with the emergence of the Black nationalist movement, the Black Panthers in particular, that this created a rupture with American Jews. And in some ways, that's a true story. So, for example, some of the more radical or more leftist or more activist Black nationalist groups expressly asked white leaders to leave the groups to allow for a particularist embrace by Blacks working on their own behalf and not sort of relying on white individuals within their groups. And most of those white leaders were Jewish. So that is in part not an untrue statement. But what he's recognizing is something that's sort of lost in the weeds, is that as the Black nationalist movement and the Black Panthers were emerging, a very large number of relatively mainstream Jewish leaders actually saw that as a good thing. There's this perception that there was antagonism from the get-go, right? Black Panther is bad for the Jews, but absolutely not. There were some who said that, but there were just as many Jewish leaders who looked to that shift as potentially being productive, as an important and strategic move for Black civil rights, and a necessary one that they understood. They understood why Blacks wanted to assert that sort of Black nationalism. And they understood it from a Jewish perspective, because they understood the value of that kind of Jewish nationalism and Jewish particularism, and they recognized a sort of mirror image of why that would work. And they were actively supportive in some instances of the rise of Black Panthers and Black nationalism. Of course, there's a lot more detail that I could have to unpack.
Right.
That's the
so first of all, that's a great answer, and I think speaks to a moment we're in today, right? What is the role of the Jewish community and American Jews to this upswelling of Black Lives Matter in all the ways? I'm not saying the organization, because that's too complicated, but the impetus for there to be a redressing. So I think that, again, this history, although it's history, it speaks to the moment. We're still in this moment, in this post-war moment.
Absolutely.
So I want to thank you again for such rich material. And I want to just tell everyone that we, besides next week, Dr. Drinkwater will finish up somehow this incredible survey of post-war American Jews and counterculture. And the Bildner Center is sponsoring 2 other public programs. On April 12th, my colleague Jeffrey Chandler will be in conversation with American Jewish literary scholar Josh Lambert on Jeffrey Chandler's new book, Yiddish, Biography of the Language. And on April 22nd, Anthony Mordechai Tzvi Russell, a bass singer, will be in performing and in conversation with Joshua Kuhn from USC on Anthony's artistry, which is a combination of Yiddish spiritual folk traditions and African-American traditions of music, and should be a great, wonderful way for us to sort of end our semester. So I hope to see you there, and I certainly hope to see you next week. And I want to, again, thank Professor Drinkwater for this masterful zoom through the post-war years. So good night, everyone. Be safe.